Right. So this meeting will be recorded and posted on the IARPIC Collaborations website and on our YouTube channel. So if you have colleagues who you think would be interested in this discussion, but who weren't able to join us today, please do share that with them. Let me see. Yes, again, as a reminder, you can mute and unmute yourself in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or if you're joining by phone, that's *6. I'm going to go ahead and ask folks, because we have a pretty good group here today, to please introduce yourself in the chat. It would be great just to know your name, affiliation, if this is your first IARPIC collaborations meeting, and your interest in the topic today. And I just want to recognize that IARPIC Collaboration Space is a community. IARPIC Collaborations is a community space, and our code of conduct aims to support a community where all people feel open and safe to participate, introduce new ideas, and inspire others. And so if you haven't already read our code of conduct, I will put a link for that in the chat. And before we get started, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary and ancestral home to many different Indigenous peoples. And when we speak about Alaska or the Arctic, we're speaking about a place where Indigenous peoples have had a long and deep history of stewarding the lands and waters there. And it is vital that we make space for and listen carefully to Indigenous folks and their knowledge. And I encourage folks on this call to keep that in mind during our discussion. Welcome, everyone. With that, I will pass it over to Sandy Starkweather, who's one of our, and Lauren Culler, who are our observing community of practice leads, and will be guiding this meeting. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Hazel, and thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. I know we have not had this community of practice meeting in a while, and so it's really nice to see so many new and familiar faces. I also want to acknowledge that we are meeting jointly with our U.S. Arctic Observing Network Federal Board today. And so welcome to those board members who've joined us. This is a conversation that we have conceived of to serve as a bit of a call and response between the activities that are happening within our federal board and that the agencies are leading on behalf of what they think are key issues of importance to advancing the Arctic Observing Network. And in a sense, the response and call comes too from the broader community of people outside of the federal family who are interested in advancing Arctic observing systems and contributing to the tools that we need to do so. So that is typical of what our community of practice focuses on, are some of these kind of meta level issues around the Arctic Observing Network. And today's conversation is a great example of that. And I hope that everybody can particularly take advantage of the large mixed room between federal and non-federal people here today to advance this conversation. We are going to focus today on the topic of inventories, and in particular, the inventories of our research infrastructures and other types of Arctic observing infrastructures that support the capabilities we have within the context of the Arctic Observing Network, which is kind of bridging the spectrum from operational agencies to more research-based concerns. It is inclusive of things that happen and are led by federal initiatives, but also things, as I said, that are state-led, community-led, led from academic sectors. And so our call today has been designed to sort of support this call and response kind of conversation. I also want to briefly share, as we're setting up the meeting, and if I can do this quickly, I will attempt to do so, that we are planning at the Arctic Science Summit Week a similarly designed, actually, I don't think I'm going to be able to share this quickly. So I'll describe the event and share the information via the chat. We're planning a showcase on March 24th, the afternoon of March 24th at the Arctic Science Summit Week meeting in Boulder, Colorado. where we would like to kind of envision or serve to contribute to a vision for the future of these coordinating efforts for advancing Arctic observing and data systems, particularly those that are sustained and address decadal scale questions. And we invite your participation. It's an open meeting. We are going to continue the inventory conversation at that meeting and discuss some other topics as well. And your contributions, the USA on Board will be there either virtually or in person, as we hope you will be as well to join that conversation. So I just wanted to preview that opportunity and to say that this discussion is to prepare us better for that conversation. And then we envision having some follow-on conversations also in the context of this community of practice or other contexts. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is David Allen. He is one of the co-chairs of the USA on Board, and he has been working very closely with Hazel and the agencies of the USA on Board to advance the efforts needed to better inventory our efforts from the federal side. And then we will follow that by some polling and some other speakers that I will introduce when they are coming up to the virtual podium. So David, if you're ready, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. So thanks, Sandy, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak to you today. Let me see if I can get my screens organized here. Let's see. There we go. So this this presentation,
David, we're actually not seeing, we're seeing a different screen of yours, the one with Google Meet. Or sorry,
that's
with
not
the
helpful.
Zoom.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How about now?
That looks much better. Thank you.
Woohoo. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you to Hazel and Sandy, and thanks to everyone who made this possible. This is the culmination of a lot of work and a lot of different attempts to try to get the information that I think is sorely needed and sorely needs to be shared with the broader community, as well as I think mutually understood by the federal community. So I think we finally have a path forward, and we want to sort of talk about that with you today. So enjoy the kitschy title. I'm going to move on now. Registries, Maps, and More, discussion of Arctic observing inventories. So first, a little bit of context. This is a sort of organization gram, if you will, of how the USA on Board is oriented.
We lost your screen.
Lost the share again?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Thanks for that.
Yes.
How about now? Okay. So first, a little bit of context. The USA on Board sits in the center here. That's the federal board, and then it overlaps and interacts with the IARPC principles. Number one, which is the coordination center for a lot of federal Arctic research, and IARPC collaborations on the bottom here, which is the broader mixed community of academics, non-governmental organizations, federal entities, and a host of other organizations. And then on the left, we also have the international piece, which is the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks piece. And then on the right, all of the amazing work that Sandy and Hazel do, which is the USA on assessment and partnerships work, which really makes this whole activity whole. So I wanted to provide that context so that for those who are not familiar with USA on and the federal board. Just for transparency, I guess, as well as context again, this is the current configuration of the board. We have most of the federal agencies that are represented in IARPC. on the board, and you can see Thorsten Marcus up in the top left, and Lauren and myself, who are the tri-chairs of the organization, and Thorsten is the current chair, and then various of our colleagues across the federal enterprise, including Nancy Sung, who is currently the executive director sitting in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Another piece to bring into this that is sort of a driver for a lot of this work, we have the 22 Aon report to Congress that was delegated to the US Aon board by OSTP and IARPC, and that focused on this the need to maintain a sustained Arctic observing network, including recommendations on the implementation and construction of a network. And that was direction from the Congress. And if you're interested in downloading that report, I imagine most of you have seen it, but that report is available with that QR code on the bottom right of the slide. Now, from that 2022 report and associated efforts within the US Aon board, we have developed a work plan, and today, so that includes this building toward a better definition of the Arctic Observing Network and a working inventory of all the Arctic observing assets, as well as advancing gaps analysis work focused on risks and hazards in the Alaskan Arctic. Proactively support data management and technology collaborations, and finally, connecting and aligning with existing efforts to build research capacity and advance equitable and ethical observing network development. Today, we're talking about this first piece, which is the really trying to understand and come to a mutual understanding of what the Arctic Observing Network actually is, and having that working inventory of Arctic observing networks. Obviously, this is going to be a living document, but having some kind of codification of this is going to be really critical to ultimately drive all of these other activities. So one of the things that's also important is that we also intend for this work, particularly the inventory work at the start, to really drive collaboration across the entire IARPC and Arctic community, and we want to also make sure that it supports other projects such as the Registry of Polar Observing Networks, which is now has some funding in place to actually go from a demonstration phase, which you can see that disclaimer in yellow on that yellow band. We're now going to go into maybe not full implementation of the ROPON, but we're going to make it a heck of a lot further than we have been for the last few years. So just the vision is that the US Aon actually connects all these observing networks to the ROPON to build a more comprehensive inventory of executives observing assets. So US Aon is first focusing on creating an inventory of observing within these parameters. We've actually, US Aon board members, you may recognize a slightly longer list that I presented a few weeks ago to you based on the conversations that we've been having with you. We've actually shortened and modified that list, and I expect through additional conversations and iterations, we will probably land on a final set of parameters or criteria. But right now we're talking about US, and this is the primary focus of these parameters is to actually make this process doable, to make it possible to actually make progress on it. So I expect through future iterations, through future discussions, we might actually be able to come to a more fully understood or sussed out set of parameters that we can sort of build in layers, if you will. So the first set of parameters that we're using are US federal agency funded and or led, Arctic focused, using the current ARPA definition, which actually overlaps with many other standings of the definitions of the Arctic. And I think it's really important to note that through our discussions, yes, we are using the ARPA definition, but we are doing our very best not to draw hard lines based on conversations that we've had with a variety of different partners, as well as communities in the Arctic that don't necessarily see borders in the same way that we may try to define or need to define in some cases. We're trying to focus on sustained efforts, and I think that's going to be a thread. They can be emerging efforts that are intended to be sustained, but we're trying to focus on sustained efforts, and we're trying to focus on both operational as well as research assets. In an earlier effort that Hazel and I embarked on behalf of the board, we got stuck with a variety of different conversations, and we're going to end up with a less than satisfactory product because everyone was focused on, oh, well, this is an IARPIC activity, so therefore we need to focus on the R in IARPIC and therefore be completely avoid and essentially pretend that a lot of operational assets that still significantly contribute to the Arctic Observing Network didn't exist. So we're trying to get around that with this current iteration and include operational as well as research assets. And again, you'll see on this note down on the bottom, short-term and emerging projects will be added to the as agency capacity allows. So we hope that from collecting this information from all of the IARPIC agencies, that there are many different activities that will actually be informed by and possibly even driven by having this really powerful information, and that includes observing, planning, and implementation, international collaboration, development of a geolocated asset map, future reports to Congress, the U.S. ARC, as well as the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and also I think most importantly, in that couched in that first bullet, there's also an analysis piece that I think that USAON and SAON and the SAON roads process can also really hopefully be informed and driven by having this information. Where are the gaps? What opportunities are there, et cetera. And then there is a possible change that's coming to the ARPA law. This was originally founded in 1984, and there are discussions on the Hill right now to update the ARPA because I think they want after this many years or this many decades of experience, congressional members and others are realizing that there are some gaps and edits needed to the ARPA Act to get closer to what was intended by the Act. And I think the most important message from at least this is just one of the proposed revisions, but this piece bolded in the center is the one that we want to draw your attention to is develop a joint research infrastructure plan with a single budget. This is the federal agencies may ultimately be driven to develop this joint research infrastructure plan with a single budget that would fund infrastructure activities of both the Commission and IARPIC. So that is a potential change that's coming down the line. It's completely unclear when those changes would be implemented and possibly ratified, but that's another driver of this work. So this is an interesting diagram, and this is another sort of more graphical way to present the concept that we're trying to drive home today. So we have on the left-hand side of the diagram, we have a variety of different types or inputs of in this case observing assets, right? And then on the left, or on the on the right-hand side, we have some possible outputs. Obviously, based on the slide a couple of slides ago, there are many different outputs that this activity could inform. But we define on the left-hand side again these a variety of different ways that things could be articulated. One, and you see the sort of stoplight piece of this. The green, well-defined Arctic observing assets. That's the easy bin for us to focus on. Then in the middle, we have the yellow, distributed or regularly defined observing assets. So they may actually require a little bit more intervention to fully understand how they contribute to the aeon. And then finally, highly distributed or not Arctic or Alaska delineated and complex or non-existent metadata. Obviously, this is the most complicated bin. But nevertheless, all of these things are intended to feed into the inventory, which hopefully will encompass these sites, mobile platforms, campaigns, initiatives, as well as operational and research activities. So this was more for the board than anyone else, but just to let you know where we are right now. These are the tasks that we're asking our board members to look at. And in the case of green, it's more of a validation piece, as well as identifying the POC that will directly feed into the ROPON activity. In the middle column or the middle bin, the yellow one on the stoplight, really we need to try to figure out how to define what portion or what part of that activity needs to feed into the aeon activity. And then finally, on the very bottom, we need to encourage or enact institutional policy towards better data management, or understand what the Arctic piece of that actually is. And again, that will all of those inputs will ultimately result in the aeon activity. And I think, as articulated on a previous slide, again, there are a variety of different outputs. These are just a couple of them on the right. So I've spoken enough. Now it's time for us to start operationalizing and getting some reactions from you, the community. So what we're going to do next is an interactive polling that will be led by Hazel, that will include questions like, how would you use an observing asset inventory? Because I'm sure we did not come up with an exhaustive list, and I'm sure once we have that in place, there will be all kinds of other activities that will flow from it. What level of detail? This is a feedback piece. What level of detail is important to you in such an inventory? Is it important to just have, for instance, in some of the discussions that we've had with the agencies, we've talked about the parameters that are at a relatively high level, what parameters are actually being measured, or what types of parameters are actually being measured. And then finally, in a more open-ended input piece, what other input do you have on our approach? And realize too that in this latter bin, Hazel and I have been at this. Hazel, Sandy, and I have been at this for a while now, and I think we finally come up with an approach that should get us a data set. It may not be the perfect data set, and I think it will be a working document or a living document, no matter what we ultimately land on. But this will actually make it something that we can actually bite off and do, and then we have something to work with and ultimately to build upon. And then finally, we're also going to have presentations from ROPON itself, as well as the Arctic Observing Viewer. And with that, I will turn it back to our chair, and thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Well, I think everybody can begin to get a flavor of why it's so important to bring all these different communities together today, to align our interests and create a better shared base of understanding about how we want to use inventories. So Hazel is going to queue up a Mentimeter poll for everybody to engage in, and this is just a way to get some of your impressions and inform what we're doing in this call and beyond. So I'm going to turn it over to Hazel for instructions. We have a lengthy discussion period at the end. I see some things popping up in the chat, and I just want to say, if you are able to stay for the discussion at the end, these are some great questions that we would love to take on at that time.
All right. Thank you. So now we're going to move into some polling. Please let me know if you can't see my screen or hear me, because I might not be able to see the chat through this. But there's a couple different ways that you can access this poll. The first is I've just dropped a link in the chat, so you can just click on that and it'll open on your computer. If you'd rather use your phone, you can scan the QR code that you should see on the screen now. And the third option is to go to menti.com and use the code that you also see at the top of the screen, 8177-3200. So I'll just give a moment for folks to join. When you join, you'll see something that looks very much like my screen share, and you won't be able to access any questions. I will move to the questions in just a moment. I see some nodding heads. Are folks getting in there? Okay, give just one more moment. Again, you can click the URL that is in the chat. You can scan the QR code, or you can go to menti.com and enter the code 8177-3200. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So the first question here, which is open response, so you can just type in the box here, is how would you use an observing asset inventory? So if this would inform your work or help you do your job in some way, we would love to know about it. Oh, I did not mean to do that. That's okay. Once folks have entered some answers, you'll be able to, I believe, put like a thumbs up or upvote, one that mirrors how you would work as well. So you'll be able to just say yes to other things folks have entered. All right, and why are they? I see someone who's answered on my phone.
Yeah, for some reason, the screen I was typing into went away.
Oh, here we go. We're back.
Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. Learned a new thing about this technology tool. And I apologize if that erased what you were typing, but it looks like things are coming in now. To inform management decisions in the context of EBFM. And if someone could tell me what EBFM, ecosystem-based something, maybe something else. Quantitatively assess representativeness of observations and identify critical gaps, strengths and gaps again, disciplinary and geographic gaps, model data synthesis. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, sorry, you asked about EBFM. It's ecosystem-based fisheries management
Okay,
for the
great.
group.
Thank you. Fisheries was the piece I was missing. Perfect. Get a better sense of who potential collaborators are. So there's this piece of improving coordination, getting to see what's out there, finding observational programs and parameters, looking for folks who to contact about collaborations, or having those links to contact information, assets to develop responsive research questions for Alaska, monitor data in a region, and then this sort of planning and implementation between agencies and between different nations. Tracking community infrastructure, looking at baseline trends. These are great. Give folks another 30 seconds. Determine how existing observing systems and parameters would be of interest to US EPA. So looking at your specific programming. Nice. And a lot of this efficiency and reducing duplication, co-locate measurements. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. Someone come off mute and yell at me to stop if it's too soon. All right. If there's anything else, you can put it in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and skip this voting phase. This didn't work the way that I thought it would. So just continue forward. And the next piece here is what level of detail is important to you in such an inventory. So same style. All right, we have some responses coming in. Someone wants name, agency, sites, parameters measured, point of contact, and specifically identified opportunities for collaboration. Lead PIs and data made available, and what data is available for the public or metadata, network and site level data, observing parameters collected, and where do you find the data, locations and link to data repository, specific locations and times, in addition to other metadata, meta file, user-friendly, organized data sets instead of individual observing systems or instruments. Julian day averages are appreciated rather than 15-minute measurements. Numerical trends for graphing grants, story type. If possible, to get a whole view of the data, possibly private data as well, local indigenous TEK data. So is that just knowing where private data, where there is private data versus sharing the data itself? I'm not sure. I'd like to clarify that, feel free. Site level. And we'll capture this after the meeting as well and can share it around via the IARPIC collaborations website. And so with that, I apologize, we are running a little bit behind, so I will move us forward. And in fact, maybe I will say, let's pause on sharing any other input to this approach, and we'll hear from some of the other groups working on this and then circle back around. So with that, I will pass it back to Sandy.
Great. Thanks everyone for that. I think that is going to be a really nice reference set of information coming from this meeting, and I think can help guide everybody moving forward. So you've heard from David a short preview of the next couple of talks. These are things that are being led outside of the agencies, mostly from the academic side. Where people are trying to help make sense and create utilities for organizing inventories. And so I'm going to just introduce all three speakers and topics, and then you guys can just roll one to the next in the interest of time. So first, we're going to hear from Bill Manley about the Registry of Polar Observing Networks, which David mentioned in his talk. He is then going to pass it over to Alice Bradley, who is currently serving as the one of the co-chairs for Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Committee on Networks and their interest in inventories. And then finally, we'll hear from Craig Tweedy, who is one of the principal investigators for the Arctic Observing Viewer. And so please feel free to say more about yourself as you begin your talk. And I will turn it to Bill first.
All right, thanks, Sandy. And so scream out if you don't see my screen. And we're going to swap displays. Everybody see the title slide? Okay, good. Great. So thank you. Today, I'd like to describe a collaborative effort and a new information resource to help optimize polar observing and enable discovery of observing infrastructure and activities. So broadly speaking, as you all may know, there is recognized need for an integrated Arctic observing system with a means of identifying strengths and gaps, a knowledge map, perhaps, to clarify directions, and ways to build capacity to better meet observing goals. However, the challenge is obtaining a comprehensive perspective across a highly fragmented and distributed landscape of observing efforts. Hundreds of agencies, organizations, projects, and programs observe climate and environmental phenomena at high latitudes, each with its own geographic extent, thematic scope, governance, or funding. So one could argue that without coordination or improved information sharing, it is difficult to meet user needs or to observing goals. So to help address this challenge, the Polar Observing Assets Working Group, or POWIG, was formed in 2020 under Seon Khan to make observing related information, structured information, more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, the FAIR principles. And to act as a bridge between the polar observing and polar data communities, making it easier for organizations to populate, deploy, and share catalogs of observing assets, and to reduce cost and effort and duplicated effort while showcasing and integrating across systems. So feel free to get involved with POWIG. We meet monthly. It's open. So POWIG is concerned with what we call observing assets, discrete individual components of in situ observing, the in situ infrastructure, research and monitoring sites, such as stations, facilities, vegetation plots, moorings, super sites, etc., mobile platforms such as buoys, ships, and more, as well as related activities such as scientific research projects, field-based campaigns and scientific cruises, and the overarching programs, networks, and observing systems themselves. These are the things that we call observing assets. So there are many networks and related organizations that track and share information about their own observing assets. And here we have grouped them into which asset types they track: sites, projects, mobile platforms, campaigns, and initiatives. So these groups have inventories of their observing assets to meet their own internal goals. But note that each of them is somewhat limited in scope by funding or mandate or discipline or extent. Yeah, we could talk about that more later. So for you all, we wanted to delve a bit deeper into how POWIG created those definitions for observing assets and asset types. So we looked into how these 44 portals themselves categorize what they track. So here shown are with font size proportional to the number of portals that used a specific term. So for example, there were 16 portals that simply used the term projects, whereas there is a multitude of other sometimes related terms. So we decided to cluster those based on similarity. This is inductive reasoning. For example, there are many portals that track things like sites that also includes what agencies called stations or plots or infrastructures or facilities or field sites, observing sites, research sites, etc. So, and then we came up then with these simplified categories for asset types. As a related note, so in this world of observing infrastructure activities, we can apply some of the benefits towards interoperability within the data world for data sets. But in this world of observing, there's greater heterogeneity and complexity, right? Than, for example, what is called a data set. Something to be aware of. So that's how we came up with these definitions. And we would suggest that definitions are terribly important to lay out clearly to avoid the problems of apples and oranges and, well, and even grapefruit that are inherent to several previous inventories. So shifting gears then, Pollwig laid the foundation for building the Registry of Polar Observing Networks, or ROPON, which is a catalog of systems and related organizations that coordinate and track observing activities and infrastructures. So it was created as a collaborative effort by the University of Colorado Instar, the Arctic Portal, and SAN. As mentioned, it's currently a prototype for demonstration purposes with only 22 networks. But we've recently received funding from NOAA to fully develop ROPON beyond a proof of concept to a comprehensive catalog. And you can go there now and browse, search, or filter for summary cards, one for each network. If you click on a card, you will see discovery level details about that network, including network description, observational scope, spatial extent, links to a data repository, one or more, and links to more information, including whether or not they track their own observing assets and whether or not they follow metadata standards or protocols, standardized protocols, and how to access their asset level catalog. So in ROPON, there are observing networks that we defined specifically as systems or organizations that coordinate or conduct observation and monitoring, blah, blah, blah. But also included in ROPON are discovery portals that are not networks per se, but which compile and share information about observing assets. So this includes RMAP, AOV, ESAFIQ, PolarDex, and others. So there are some asset level aggregating metadata catalogs. Might be a better term. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. Beyond ROPON, we have also proposed to NOAA to build next year a prototype polar observing site discovery tool. The idea here is to harvest site level information from 5 source catalogs of observing sites: AOV, WMO Oscar, DIMES SDR from Elter, SIOS, and Interact. So these are organizations that have shared asset level, site level metadata through machine readable endpoints. So this sort of approach from aggregation from compatible endpoints has been accomplished in the polar data realm, but it's experimental for observing assets, and hinges on these catalogs making their metadata records publicly accessible. So note that the Polar Observing Site Discovery tool would not replace any of these source catalogs. And indeed, it will rely on them to be comprehensive. So if any of these source catalogs go dark, the new tool will not be successful. But the idea here is to have many network sites, of which we're talking about, probably 100,000 sites, together in one place where, let's say you're interested in building out ecofoci further, well, you can see which station SIOS already has in place, or the European LTR or whatever. And I did want to go back briefly and say that about ROPON. So ROPON is a catalog of networks. It's not a catalog of observing assets such as sites, projects, etc. So anyway, proposed experimental site discovery tool aggregating from primary sources. So all of this is with the goals of integrating polar observing to better meet user needs, such as enabling science planners to assess status overlaps and gaps. Network managers and logistics managers to co-locate, say, where there's already comms or power, to optimize limited resources. Funding officers to avoid duplicated effort, researchers to identify or collaborate with facilities or projects, and community members to discover and engage with and leverage observational efforts and data collected nearby. These are some of the use cases that we've identified for ROPON. So here are a few recommendations that, speaking on behalf of POWIG, that we would make to you all for your consideration, and that would be to support US AON's efforts for an inventory, engage in POWIG, particularly if you would like to build out or share your own asset catalogs, take advantage of existing portals for observing related information, and perhaps most importantly, encourage the sharing of observing related metadata, particularly following standards and vocabularies to better meet user needs. Thank you. I will pass it off to Alice Bradley.
Thanks, Bill. So I do not have slides because I got back from leading a field program last night. But I do want to talk a little bit about the SAON, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Committee on Networks. So this is one of the kind of two primary working groups within SAON. SAON, as many of you know, it followed the Arctic Council's pause following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the Committee on Networks, even prior to that, was undergoing a leadership transition and was kind of at a lull in activity. And so it has been a couple of years since the Committee on Networks was particularly active. So we're in a rebuilding phase at this point, recruiting new members, kind of refreshing who is involved, and then revisiting the work plan that was developed in 2018. So kind of primary on that work plan is to conduct an inventory of observing in the Arctic. As I think this call is well established, that is a little bit easier said than done. And so as the Committee on Networks is in this rebuilding phase, we're really looking at are kind of two things. The first is the use cases and kind of what does an inventory of such, like, what would an inventory need to accomplish? And I think the questions that Hazel asked earlier really reflect that well, that for many use cases, the level of specificity in this kind of proposed inventory would need to be very high. And then the other question, which kind of parallels this, is what capacity is there actually for doing these inventories? In some places, and SAON works at very much the international level. If you're in Portugal, it's pretty easy to put together a inventory of polar observing assets. You ask a few people and you have a pretty good list of what's going on. Coming from the US, that challenge is quite a lot harder. And so that's where I think this particular effort coming out of US AON to really think about what do these broader inventories look like in the US context in particular, and kind of how do we collectively wrap our brains around what's going on, I think are the really important questions as we're looking forward into the international space. POWIG is affiliated with SAON Con, so that conversation certainly will be ongoing. But at this stage, we're really just kind of looking forward to seeing what people are doing, getting a good sense of what's happening in the different SAON member countries, as we're, and I hate to say this, kind of inventorying the inventories before kind of refreshing the 2018 work plan into something that we can move forward with.
Great, thanks, Alice. Welcome back, and we'll be looking forward to tracking that effort as an important kind of context and driver for what we're doing here nationally. So we'll turn it over to Craig now, and thanks for your patience with your questions. We're going to have a lengthy discussion period at the end.
Hey, thanks, Alice. Thanks, Sandy. Is everyone seeing the screen okay? Thumbs up.
Yes,
Thanks,
but
Alice.
it's very tiny.
Oh,
On my screen, it's very tiny.
okay.
It works.
Yeah, okay, let's run with it. If it's too bad, I guess let me know and I'll stop and try and figure it out.
You can
Anyway.
always zoom in on your own screen for what it's worth.
Yeah, I've actually got it maximized on mine already, so.
Oh,
not
sorry.
sure.
Everyone else can zoom in on their own
Oh,
screens.
sorry. Yeah, thanks, Alice. Yeah, thanks. All right. Yeah, so my name's Craig Tweedy, and I'll be tag teaming this presentation with Alison, close friend and colleague, and we've been working together for many, many years on various efforts that are focused on web mapping that's related to Arctic observing. So today we will focus on the Arctic observing viewer, but we learnt last week that it will no longer be supported after next month. And so today what we wanted to do was to kind of roll in some experiences with some of the other observing efforts as well, and kind of use this as an opportunity to maybe highlight some lessons learned and perhaps offer some wrap up the talk today with some suggestions of kind of next steps and whatnot. So one of the main reasons why, let's sit back and ask the question, why do we build web mapping applications to showcase inventories of Arctic observing? Well, there's a couple of use cases that we've listed there. We could go on and on and on about use cases, but really the bottom line here is that if you put a ton of effort into developing large, comprehensive, and accurate inventories, there's just all manner of things that you can then go and do with that. But if you don't have that high quality baseline informational data set, coming up with addressing all of these things in a quantitative and effective manner, where you'll truly have sustained impact, I would really question that personally. So what we try and do is rather than sort of dish out sort of flat spreadsheets and laundry lists of sites and whatnot, we try to make that information interactive, and we use web mapping tools in order to do that, because it's really one of the few means by which you can present data and information across geospatial, temporal, and organizational scales, and provide mechanisms for people to interact and interrogate that data set in kind of ways in which you might not have even thought of as a developer, but as a user and with evolving use cases, these platforms allow this sort of thing to actually happen. So I'll hand over to Alison now. Alison, let me know when you want the slides changed.
Thanks, Craig. Craig suggested that we provide a little perspective on where we got started with this whole inventorying process. And Craig and I connected back in 2003 when he was approached from the Nupiat Corporation based in Barrow who wanted to know where all these observing assets were going in on the UIC lands around the village and across the Barrow Peninsula. And this was sort of a bottom-up effort. No top-down agency was asking to do this. It was actually the community. It's very much a community-driven effort that the researchers bound together and helped compile this data. And so with that effort, we compiled over 35,000 research locations around the Barrow Peninsula with differential GPS, so very detailed site level. That then evolved over the years into other applications that were curious if we could mimic, this capability. There's the Circum-Arctic Environmental Observatory Network, the Arctic Research Mapping application to track projects. And then in 2013, Erica Key, who is then the NSF Aon Program Officer, wanted to have some information about, to be able to do a look back on where the NSF observing assets were actually being funded. Craig, can you advance the slide? And so with that, the Arctic Observing Viewer was created to start focusing on what NSF investments were made across the region. And that has grown to over 50,000 observing sites. We've also been trying to address the needs of a USAON for information such as stream gauges and buoys that are moorings that are tracked by NOAA. But in this example here, Craig is highlighting the International Tundra Experiment, which has been an ongoing project funded by NSF since 1994. We've got links to specific sites in the field on the North Slope, plus connections to where the data are archived at the NSF Arctic Data Center, as an example. And the latest iteration of this viewer was really focused on user stories for the needs for redevelopment. And as mentioned, the URLs, it will be available through Battelle to the end of this month, and then we'll be going back to an external website for kind of mothballing. We're referring to it as after January 31st. Next slide. Nope, looks like it repeated, Craig. Another related effort that includes a lot of NSF-funded tracks. We've got over 264 research cruises across the polar region. This is an example of the field campaigns that Bill Manley mentioned that we observe on a polar view with the ability to search by PI, initiative, and key research vessels that provide support primarily for NSF-funded research across the region. With RMAP and this research cruise viewer, neither are really as comprehensive as we'd like. They don't include all the IARPC agencies, but when information is easily available, we've been harvesting it. So with that, Craig, why don't you go to the next one? Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Alison.
Sure.
And I guess what I'm showing you here is a prototype application that we developed fairly recently. What you see here was developed by a junior technician in less than a week. And the question that we're asking is, what is the footprint of observing assets throughout Alaska, particularly as that relates to tribal lands, what lands are sort of saturated with environmental observations and which areas may be underserved by measurements of different observations. So what we're showing here is just one fairly simple, straightforward use case. It was very, very easy to engineer and implement, but it was only made possible because it sits on top of this fairly substantial site level georeference, spatially, temporally relevant and organizationally sort of mediated data set, this inventory of AOV and RMAP that we've compiled over some years now. So again, there's all sorts of cool visualizations you can do with this to look at numbers of sites in different lands within different proximity to villages and other things like that. But what we're sort of leading towards here is trying to use this data to begin to assess equity as that relates to native lands throughout Alaska. So again, just one use case, very simple, quick to engineer, but only possible because it sits on top of these inventories. So very much supportive of the direction that USAON is going here. Now back to you, Alison.
Just briefly wanted to cover some lessons learned here as we've been, compiling over 50,000 observing sites here. As Craig mentioned before, yeah, this is more than just a static spreadsheet. We do have an interactive, map to allow you to interact with the inventory. And we've worked pretty hard to do some semi-automated crosswalks whenever possible to interrogate websites, repositories, and to adopt standards such as the Registry of Observing organizations to make things more interoperable. And we would like to also recognize that there are a number of observing networks out there that are actually doing a great job of providing site-focused information. And we've pulled a lot of our sites from those networks. And that, software basically doesn't age well. And so it's, agile software development strategies are, just really important and key for iterative development. And then there's the challenges, working towards a shared vision with a sustainable funding model, I think is really important if these inventories are going to move forward. I think that data management policies need to explicitly require archiving the observing sites moving forward. This can't be a bottom-up kind of effort like we did in Barrow. And the data wrangling from fragmented resources is just painful and time-consuming, and there's a huge potential for duplication of effort without the adoption of persistent IDs. And just in general, the lack of interoperability for machine-readable access and control vocabularies needs to be improved. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, so if I just sort of step back for a minute here, and we sort of think about all of the different sort of web mapping applications that we've built over the last 20 years or so, and some of the links are provided here. And you sort of start to look at the detail of what applications have been mothballed, which ones are currently in review and could end fairly soon, and which applications are not yet sort of fully hardened for sort of production level experience. You see that there's a high amount of effort goes into developing, populating, trying to sustain ongoing support for these kinds of applications. Literally, we spend a huge amount of our time every year just trying to keep things alive. And while that oftentimes comes with a sort of a high sense of failure, again, what we'd like to do here is sort of turn that around and convey some suggestions for moving forward. Because in reality, a lot of the reasons why some of the applications we've built have been mothballed, there's actually some really good reasons that this has happened. So moving forward, one of the things that at the same time as we're sort of dealing with all of this, we've been dealing with just a ton of rhetoric. And I on the left side, I'm not going to read them all out, but hopefully you'll get a few giggles out of some of the lines that are included here. That's sort of what it's intended to provoke. But it's just illustrative of people that have and are focusing on inventories. This is some of the rhetoric that you kind of have to deal with and get over when you're talking with various people. But the take-home message here is that rhetoric is often conveyed by people that are not even using the inventories to begin with, people that are not in decision-making positions. So we really have to overcome a lot of this, and a lot of that rhetoric sort of parallels a lot of the same kind of mindset that the data community was in about 20 years ago. And thankfully, we've moved well beyond that. So it'd be really nice to see the inventory sort of efforts that are ongoing be able to move beyond those sorts of mindsets as well. Because in short, those shortcomings have most definitely impacted the current thinking and some of the current capacities that we have. And in essence, what I'd really strongly promote, and I think USAON is going in this direction, which is fantastic, is that you really need to promote inventories and give inventories the same weight as you do observations and data. And I think we can't kid ourselves that, coming up with inventories and sustaining them, it's hard work. It's time consuming, it's expensive. And we need a higher level of strategy sort of conveyed to this. And we have to realize that we're not going to get it right the first time. It's going to need multiple iterations. And it takes many, many years for these inventories to become of a size, accuracy, and level of completeness before they actually become useful. So they're very much value adding. They're very much like long-term time series data of temperature or biodiversity or any other environmental metric you might think of. But that's the kind of way that I think that we have to start thinking about inventories. They're absolutely critical baseline data set. So just to wrap up here, I guess I wanted to sort of come up with maybe the top 5 suggestions for moving forward. And what I'm kind of hoping is that people are surprised by the first 3, in the sense that I'm not recommending or suggesting that we need more resources, or we need more toys or computers or anything like that. I think one of the prime challenges that we're dealing with in the inventory community is a human problem, and it's a mindset problem. And the mindset for building and maintaining the inventories has just not been there. We really need to think of the things like that Alice and Bill have talked about today, where we're linking ongoing, persistent efforts and creating capacity that's greater than some of the parts. And I'd say what we need is a new model. I'm a firm believer of the way we've been doing things in the last 20 years is not the best way of doing things. And with AOV being cut last week, we're obviously very sad about that. But I think ultimately there's lots of really, really good reasons why AOV was cut. And where it goes from here,
Craig, I just wanted to chime in. I think you guys, we kind of gave you Alice's bonus time on the agenda. But I think you're leading into some really good discussion points, and people can read the screen. So what I might suggest is that we maybe take some time. We've got about 20 minutes left in our call, and thanks, Hazel, for reminding everybody that we planned a 90-minute call. The discussion time is really to ask questions of the speakers, and for the speakers maybe to react to some of the ways in which they think we can maybe think towards what Craig is describing, this new model and vision, and have a better shared sense of these use cases. So maybe if everybody's kind of gotten a chance to take a look at these suggestions for moving forward and maybe have some questions ready to go, we could go off screen share and turn to our discussion. And a huge thanks to all of our speakers. I think this has really been very thought-provoking for me, even though I feel like I have this conversation a lot. So thanks to you all. And we're happy to entertain questions, and I'll invite Lauren to help me co-chair the discussion as you see fit.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, so please feel free to go ahead and raise your Zoom hand if you have questions, and I will attempt to call in folks in the order that their hand is raised. I'll also start going through the chat because I think there's some questions in there. But as folks kind of get questions in mind, I guess to start, I would like to it's sort of a two-sided question. One, to members of the board who are here, we've been kind of working on our inventory, our definition of what defines an Arctic observing asset, and I'm curious to hear from board members after you've heard from folks if you have ideas about maybe ways we need to further streamline that definition or expand that definition. And then I'm also curious, for those who just presented, your reactions to the way that the board is approaching the work. So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to raise your hand. Alice?
I can chime in, and looking at this from an international perspective, it would be really helpful as the board is kind of working through thinking what scope means in the context of an inventory from USAN's perspective. Getting that scope down on paper, even if it's a working draft white paper kind of situation, something that we can then circulate with partners that are working in other countries, so that even if we're not all working with exactly the same definitions, we have some idea of what others are. I think this is a space in which the US could be leading. And I think at the moment we're kind of everyone's stumbling around in the dark.
Do other countries have such a document?
Nope, not that I know of.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you. And feel free to ask other questions too. Okay, David?
Yeah, I just wanted to riff off of that. I just wonder, based on what was presented, based on the parameters that were presented initially, and recognizing that every agency is very, very different, and as a result, we are going to be collecting a bunch of different straw persons from each of the agencies. But I would love on its face to hear from you and others, whether you think we're headed in a constructive place. I've heard a lot today about the interoperability challenges and all kinds of other stuff, but I just want to make sure that we're doing something that's going to get us on a trajectory that will ultimately be helpful and constructive, and that would make me feel a lot better going into the SSW showcase, as well as just generally, on a day-to-day basis. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Craig?
Thanks, Lauren. I would say to David's comment, I see a lot of really positive moves here. Things are going really in the right direction for sure. I guess I'm just not sure people know about it. I guess I mean I contribute to multiple ION projects across different agencies, and I'm just not sure how the communities are being engaged. And there's a ton of experience out there. I'm not sure if you've done interviews with people like myself or something to get some tips on mistakes that we've made and how they could be prevented in the future, that type of thing. Just wondering how you're actually engaging, or going beyond the board itself and engaging with the Aon community per se.
Sandy, do you want to maybe answer that, or David?
Sure, maybe we can respond in turn. Sandy is better informed, so maybe you should start, or would you like to follow? Oh, okay, I can start. So I think the showcase. So we've tried this. This is a difficult issue to tackle. Number one, because I really loved your slide that talked about all the different challenges. There are even many more arguments that people make about the workforce and budgetary and other challenges associated with doing inventories. And you get a lot of pushback almost immediately when you talk about understanding what's there, even though fundamentally we all need to know what's there in order to plan it, in order to understand what gaps are and everything else. So totally appreciate your point. We, as a result of that, and a result of a variety of different fits of starts over my tenure, at NOAA, we have not done a lot of external work yet to talk with folks in the broader community. I think the showcase will be the first time where we'll actually be able to present sort of a straw person and engage with the broader community, because we have to have something. We have to have that straw person, I believe, to even start that conversation. Because right now we can talk about mistakes, we can talk about other inventory fits and starts, but if we don't have that fundamental fundamental understanding, as well as mutual understanding within the agencies of what the Arctic Observing Network is, then I think it's very difficult to have a conversation. It's just sort of hand wavy, and I get super frustrated with those hand wavy conversations and would really like to have something more concrete to discuss. And I think there will be plenty of opportunity to build on what we present at the showcase. And Sandy, I don't know whether that aligns with what you were going to offer in terms of a response, but please feel free to correct me or add.
Yeah, I think it's great. And so I think an important thing to point out is that Hazel's been a real glue person because she participates in the POA and has been directly informing the board's efforts from the side of the POA, looking at the use cases, looking at the structure and such. And so there's an overall intention for that alignment to be in place. But I think the board also had to get really firm in its own rationale for the inventory, which enhances those use cases, in fact. And I think that's something that we want to discuss at the showcase as well. So there's some hands in the air, and Bill seems to be kind of adding a hand to his hand because he maybe wants to just jump right in there. But I know Leandra's had her hand up for a while as well. So Bill, if you can be quick, and then we'll go to Leandra and then Alice.
I was just, it'd be helpful when we can, if we still have time, to pull up the, what's it called, Mentimeter responses and think about, wow, how did we get there?
I think that's a great idea, Bill, and I think we can do that. We'll hear maybe next from Leandra and then Alice, and then at that point maybe go back to that. And I think there was a third question on there too that we could also just put up to prompt some discussion. So, Leandra?
Hello, thank you everyone for the presentations. This was very, very informative. I just wanted to share some impressions that I had from the presentations. So I really appreciated the presentation that talked about the ROPON and how they classified the different relevance of the data types for each program. And it was really clear to me that that very much linked with what Craig suggested, that we do need a new model. Because even within that example of how you get to those networks, there's a very strong sense of deja vu. And I'm pretty sure that all of us feel that. And I think the interface for the users is quite critical for this amount of work that is being put into this effort and the amount of money, the funding that will take. So that is one thing that I wanted to emphasize as a user. And one other thing that reminded me of that presentation was, in a way, it's kind of like you're looking for a hotel room on Kayak or something. It's pulling all these huge amounts of data, and you're getting what you want. But to do that in science is complicated, and I don't know if those types of resources are not immediately available, if other partnerships may actually help the part of a new model and a new interface. I know it's a government federal effort, but there is value in considering other strategies, because a new model would be very, very helpful. Mm-hmm. And on a practical base, because I live in Utqiagvik, is the equitable use of the data. So besides the interface, there is access. So for the second time in less than 2 years, we had the optical cable broken on the seafloor. So it just happened this Saturday. I'm only able to connect with you guys because the borough got a Starlink when this happened in 2023. But so all of the base ways of you accessing information, engaging even in a meeting, these agencies, federal agencies, they have a unique opportunity to partner, let's say for Department of Defense or anything like that, to focus on the infrastructure development of communications, secure communications in the Arctic. Because I think science alone doesn't have enough weight to pull that in the federal arena. So that is something that, given how this group is united and you have multiple partners that are from federal agencies, you can collaborate interdepartment or intersecretary and the federal level to try to pull those resources that will benefit not just the community, but the science community and defense systems. So those are some of the inputs that I took from these presentations, and it's a huge effort, and I'd like to congratulate the group on it. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. We really hear you on that, and I think it's definitely something we'll be discussing further, and thinking about the upcoming showcase too. I just want to thank you for your thoughts, and we're really looking forward to the showcases. More time together, some of us in person, some of us online, to have this dialogue between the federal and non-federal space. So thank you for that. I really appreciate your comments. Alice?
Thanks. So to David's question of like, are we going in the right direction? I genuinely have no idea, and I am not 100% sure that any of us do. I think as a community, we've started to kind of at least list out the potential use cases of these larger inventories, but I haven't seen that anyone, and I'm curious, Bill, if you have thoughts on this, has really then dug into what those use cases translate to in terms of really concrete requirements for the inventory itself. And I think the Mentimeter that Hazel put up was a really good example of that, and that we often had very common themes to the answers regarding what you're looking for in an inventory, but there was a lot of difference in what the specifics were. And I think that's where we're looking at an inventory as if it'll solve a lot of very different kinds of problems. And I'm not sure we have a great sense at this point of kind of what's required to actually solve those problems. So I'm hopeful that's something that the SAN Committee on Networks can work on in partnership with the other people who are thinking about this. But I think that is a really big open question. It's like, what does it mean to go in the right direction here?
Great, and I see Bill unmuted and Craig has his hand up. So do you both of you have a response to Alice?
I have a response.
Okay, go for it.
I'll try to be quick. We're so short on time. I think that's a really important point that, we can come up with all these use cases, but what we need to do a better job of, I think, is cataloging, tracking how such inventories have actually saved money or met user needs. I have a few examples. One is that AOV started actually because there was a icebreaker cruise that as it was moving through the Arctic Ocean, the staff on board saw another icebreaker behind them capturing the same observations, a huge wasted resources on duplicated effort. So I presume that with, for example, the vessel tracker and others and the IAPRIC's work on cruises has saved a lot of time and effort actually, and money. And Europeans, I would say, are farther along than the US is in terms of applying inventories for practical user needs, in particular with what they've been able to do with DIMES through the European LTER, and that's led to quantitative assessment of gaps and representativity that we just are not able to do in other areas yet.
Thanks, Bill. Craig?
I knew I couldn't compete with Bill, so yeah. But that was a great question, Alice. From our experience, we did a sort of back in 2021, all of our apps were pretty much put on hold for a year while we did a range of user studies. When we did that, and then we sort of tracked the user studies to what data would be needed, and then what functionality would be needed to be sort of applied in the apps themselves. It's sort of getting at that statement that Leandra made that the user interface is really, really important. And once you do that, for many different use cases, you realize actually there's sort of a convergence on the function, the types of information you need and the functionality that you end up applying, So over time, most definitely, you always get thrown curveballs as people think of how to use the information in new and interesting ways. It's no different than an observing data set of sea surface temperature or something like that. People think of really cool ways to innovate, but essentially, you can take care of a big chunk of that through combining use cases, a bunch of use cases, but you need a very diverse audience. You can't just go to agency folks or just, the research community. You need a bunch of different inputs. But you come up with convergence fairly quickly on all of those fronts when you do that kind of work. And we'd be happy to share that if it would help anyone along the way.
Thanks, Craig. Hazel, I wanted to ask you in the last couple minutes that we have, there's a great question in the chat about community-driven observing questions. So Hazel, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, happy to. And it is a really good question, and I think points to some of the things that folks were just talking about in terms of, to me, it's a matter of coupling this basic inventory with some additional resources. So like I could imagine a version of what the US Arctic Observing Network is that includes a really strong inventory and includes a point person who's able to field those kind of community member questions. Right now, we don't have that kind of capacity. We're a pretty small team. And so, but it's something to think about in terms of really building towards what the user needs are. And this is not the first time that I've heard that request. I've heard that from folks who work at the state level too, where that's they're getting questions about what kind of data sets are out there. And they've said, hey, can I pass those questions along to you? And I said, I'm always happy to receive those questions. And if I know who the point person is, if we have an inventory where I can better identify a point of contact or point you to an agency I know is doing that work, I'm always happy to do that work on a one-off way. But having a better coordinated approach to that, I think would be really valuable. So I appreciate the question.
Thanks so much for chairing the discussion, Lauren and Hazel. Great comment. I have placed the information about the USAON showcase back in the chat. Hazel's included the link to the Mentimeter. We obviously have not worn this conversation out. There is still plenty to discuss. And I think a couple real key action points as we progress towards our shared time together at Arctic Science Summit Week is really understanding what the board can do to better enable the kinds of questions that the community has and wants to drive forward, what our role or what the board's role can be in supporting this work, and conversely, really understanding what the community, what the board really needs the community to lead on, contribute, inform, to help shape these efforts. And so, in addition to thinking about sort of swim lanes and who does what, I think we also had some really interesting points about how inclusive we are in our thinking about what belongs in an inventory and who's going to be using it. We had an earlier comment about all of the assets in the state of Alaska, for example. The examples from Barrow, Utqiagvik, or the BAID, and then the Utqiagvik-driven questions are super compelling. And then this last question about, what about community-led observations? I think we really envision the USAON space as a very inclusive one. That's one of the conversations we're also going to have at the showcase. And so, again, I just want to really thank all of our speakers who contributed to this and some of the work that people have really been doing for more than a decade, and really acknowledge the work that Hazel and David have done to bring forward the board side of the conversation in such a good way as well. So great contributions from everybody who joined us. And we look forward to keeping the conversation alive as well. And so I'll pass it to Lauren for any final thoughts.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, just want to again, show appreciation for everyone who joined today and to our presenters, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. I see a lot of comments going in the chat, so we're excited for next steps with you all. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.